So last year, my wife Andrea and I finally did something that responsible adults are apparently supposed to do on a regular basis. We went and we got eye exams. We've hit that lovely age where you start realizing that there are certain appointments that you just can't ignore forever. In full transparency, we have not gotten an eye exam the entire time that we have been married. Calm down on the judgment. We've just been out there living by faith and squinting. Now, out of all the things that could possibly get said during an eye exam, there was one question that came out of absolutely nowhere. Because the examiner looked at Andrea and asked, "Have you ever been around chicken houses?" Which is kind of a wild thing to hear when you're sitting in that chair with your chin in that weird machine. And it also feels like more of a commentary on the way you might smell rather than something to do with your eyesight. But the strange thing is that she was right. The second house that we had ever lived in was in Peachland, North Carolina. Andrea was serving at a small rural church out in the middle of nowhere. And one thing that I personally remember very, very clearly about that place is that there was an abundance of chicken houses. But this does beg the question, how in the world would you know that from looking at someone's eye? Well, apparently, there is a very specific fungus that grows in soil mixed with chicken waste. And the spores from that fungus, if they get into the human eye, it can scar it. Now, fun fact, during our time in Peachland, Andrea was training for a marathon, which meant that she was out running on rural country roads pretty much all the time. And when chicken farmers sell their chickens, one of the things that they do is they open up those houses to the air, let them air out while they get ready to restock. And at some point, apparently, while Andrea was out on one of those runs, one of those spores got carried by the wind or something and just so happened to land in her eye, and it scarred it permanently. But the part that really got our attention came next. Because the examiner told Andrea that if the scar, that the scar would be there for the rest of her life, but that she was actually pretty lucky, because if that scar had just been a centimeter closer to the center of her eye, she would have been blind in that eye forever. I know. I'm going to be honest with you. We've talked about that scar a lot since. It's become like a random thing that we'll bring up and even sort of a small inside joke. Because think about it, before we sat down for that eye appointment, we did not even know that Andrea had a scar. But the difference between irrelevant and drastically life-changing was literally measured in about a centimeter. That's how much the placement of that scar mattered. But if you think about it, that's kind of what makes scars such strange things. Because some scars are obvious, and sometimes they're hidden, sort of like Andrea's. Some scars are physical, some scars are not. But the truth is that if you live enough life, eventually everybody is going to carry some type of scar. For some people, it might be a mark left behind from surgery or an accident or a childhood fall. Maybe a moment where the body healed, but did not heal back in exactly the same way. For others, scars are not the kind that you might be able to point to on the body at all, but rather they are emotional, relational, spiritual. They come from grief, from betrayal, from fear, from things that were said, from things that were done. And I think that that's also what makes something like scars kind of complicated. Because most scars, they don't look the same as everyone else's, and they don't get carried the same way. And so one person might hear the word scar and they think of a faint line on their knee from when they did something dumb. But another person might hear the word scar and their mind goes somewhere they really just don't like to think about. Scars might be common among us, but they are never generic. And they are always tied to a story. They are, in a very real way, history carried forward. They are the evidence that something happened, and sometimes that history is light enough to laugh about. It can be a story you tell, like a weird story about chicken fungus scarring your eye. But not every scar works like that, does it? Some scars are moments that were not funny and not small. And some scars are tied to real pain. And because of that, scars do not just remind us of the things that happen, but yet they can actually begin to shape how we live. They can affect how we trust, how we love, how easily we let people in. Because not every scar simply says this happened or this hurt a long time ago. Sometimes scars can say, this changed me. Or maybe even scars can say, this is who you are. I think this matters a lot because this is really kind of where the tension begins for us as people of faith. Because Easter is supposed to be this great turning point. It's the highest holy day of the Christian year, the moment where death is defeated and hope is declared and new life breaks open. Easter is the proclamation that the worst thing is never the last thing. It is the announcement that God has done something decisive, something world-changing, something that makes all things new, and yet Easter comes and goes every year. And life is still life. People still grieve, still carry memories, still wrestle with marks left behind by pain and loss and failure and shame. And the tomb is empty, Jesus is risen, but the scars are still there. And I think that's what makes this so hard, because if resurrection is real, if new life is real, then what are we supposed to do with something like scars? How are we, as resurrection people, supposed to think about the things that we still carry with us even after Jesus is risen? I think these questions matter in light of our scripture reading this morning, because it's important to recognize, to acknowledge that the story of Jesus did not end the moment that he exits the tomb. In fact, the Gospel of John doesn't even present the disciples as triumphant Easter people, even on the evening of Resurrection Sunday. Mary Magdalene has already announced, "I have seen the Lord," but the gathered disciples are still hiding behind locked doors in fear. They are living in the post-resurrection reality, and yet, like us right now, they're still trying to kind of figure things out. They're still trying to just kind of put one foot in front of the other. They're still trying to make sense of everything that's happened. And into this post-resurrection figuring things out, suddenly Jesus just shows up. He appears in this locked room full of anxious and fearful people, and the first thing he does is he announces peace. And honestly, I think that's kind of beautiful, because it shows us that Jesus understands the condition of the disciples. He's picked up the vibe in the room. He recognizes that even though the resurrection, yes, has happened, that has not become fully real in the hearts and in the minds of those who are still living in the aftermath. Jesus doesn't poof into the room and instantly get irritated because they're still afraid. He doesn't shame them for still being overwhelmed. He doesn't say, "Look, guys, why are you still panicking? I handled that whole death thing." Think about it. He steps into the room that they have sealed off with fear, and the first thing that he says is, "Peace be with you." But the second thing Jesus does is also really, really curious. John says that as he spoke, that Jesus began to show them the scars in his hands and in his side. And that's kind of strange, isn't it, if you think about it? Because why did Jesus still have scars? Have you ever stopped and thought about that? Why would Jesus choose to keep the marks from such a horrible thing that happened to him? After all, if resurrection is powerful enough to bring someone back from the dead, wouldn't it also be power enough to just wipe away the evidence of violence and cruelty? Shouldn't a resurrection mean a totally polished and new body, a spotless body, a body with no sign that anything had ever gone wrong? And yet, Jesus shows up with scars. Which means that this is somehow intentional. There is something about the wounds that the risen Christ has chosen to keep. And the other question is why? Why does the risen Christ choose to reveal himself to frighten people by means of scars? Because let's be honest, that kind of feels like the opposite of comforting. I mean, if people are already scared and they're already locked away in fear, why be like, hey buddy, come look at this? It seems odd on the surface. But I want you to notice something important about the story. Notice that after Jesus speaks peace, notice that Jesus speaks peace, but it says the disciples rejoice after they see his hands and his side. The joy of the disciples is not triggered by simply hearing peace be with you, but rather by seeing the scars. Think about that. Before peace can fully make its way into their hearts, they have to first reconcile what they have experienced. They need to face the wounds. They have to acknowledge the brutality. They have to come to terms with the fact that the crucifixion really did happen. It's not enough for them just to hear the word peace spoken over them. The scars have to be recognized as real. And I think that this is why the scars matter so much in this story. The scars, they carry the history of where Jesus has been. And without the scars, part of the story goes unacknowledged. And so the wounds identify him as the crucified Christ. This is not some spiritual ghost or some vague divine apparition or presence. This is not a cleaned up version of Jesus with all the ugly parts simply removed. This is the crucified Jesus, now risen. And so the joy comes through recognition. The joy is not the joy of forgetting that bad things happened. It is the joy of discovering that bad things do not cancel the resurrection. And so instead, the scars become the very places where resurrection is fully recognized. And I think that this matters because the temptation and sometimes even the pressure of Easter Sunday is to just sort of rewind and try to forget all the scars that happened to get us here. I mean, the resurrection happened, and so I guess the crucifixion just gets erased. And yeah, the cross was awful, but now Easter has arrived, and so maybe we just get to shove all this stuff under the bed. If we're not careful, we can turn the risen Jesus into a kind of Marty McFly from Back to the Future. And Easter becomes the DeLorean traveling at 88 miles an hour, undoing all the cruelty and violence of the cross. But the scars of Jesus tell us something very different. They tell us that Easter is not a reversal. It's not a do-over. It's not God pretending like Friday didn't happen. Resurrection does not negate the past, it redeems it, and that is very, very different. Jesus does not return to frighten people with a polished body that denies what happened. He returns with scars still visible. And he meets people in a form that they can trust. The resurrection becomes a place where the scars are seen, where redemption and peace is spoken, without pretending that the history of those scars is not real. For those of you that don't know, God has blessed me with a very extroverted daughter who is not afraid to talk to people, which is both a blessing and a curse at times, because if she's curious about something, maybe about something you're wearing or something you're doing, she is not shy to ask about it. This past summer, Hollis went swimming at the pool over by Lake Junaluska, and while we were there, she noticed a woman's Assyrian scar, the scar that she had from giving birth. And my beloved extroverted daughter was very, very concerned. And of course she said, "Oh no, what happened to your tummy?" And this very kind woman, patient woman, explained that it was a boo-boo from when she had babies. And Hollis goes, "Oh no, I'm sorry you have a boo-boo on your tummy." And I remember what she said. She said, "That's okay. This is a good boo-boo because it helped me give birth to my babies." And I think that there's something very beautiful in that statement. Because most of us have a complex relationship with our scars. The wounds that caused them were painful, and they often remind us of difficult moments or difficult experiences. But at the same time, even hurtful scars can be redeemed because they point to a story that is still ongoing. A story did not end because of pain. You see, God revealed in Jesus reminds us that God's glory is not detached from suffering love. God is not embarrassed by wounded humanity. And so the scars are not leftover defects of an otherwise perfect resurrection body. They are part of how the risen Christ is known, which means that they are also part of how God knows us. To put it bluntly and plainly, you do not have to be unscarred to participate in the fullness of resurrection. You do not have to pretend that scars are not real. You do not have to erase the history of what became before in order to embody the fullness of faith. The resurrection is not reserved for people who are untouched and unmarked and neatly put back together. The resurrection is precisely for people who still carry scars. For people who have been broken and bruised by life, for people who know what it is like to carry reminders of hurt. Because in just the moment where we think our scars are too big and too ugly and too embarrassing and too disqualifying, that is right when the risen Christ steps into the room and says, "Look, I have scars too. I too carry the reminder of what pain and cruelty can do. I too bear the marks of what happened. And I am not pretending, and so you don't have to pretend either." I think that is good news for anybody still living in the after of Easter. Because notice that Jesus doesn't wait for the wounds to disappear before stepping out of the tomb. And Jesus does not wait for the scars to vanish even before speaking peace. Which means even with our scars, people can still step from places of death into places of life. Even with scars, people can still receive peace. Even with scars, people can still know joy. Even with scars, people can still be made new. The resurrection is given to the sacredly wounded and the beautifully broken, and the wonderfully scarred. That is how Jesus appeared to the disciples with scars still visible, which means he looks like us. And so, friends, may you receive the fullness of resurrection this day. May you carry it in every scarred and unscarred place, and may it continue to redeem you in every area of your life. Amen.